Welcome to this rapid revision video looking at the Cuban Revolution and the Bay of Pigs invasion. Firstly, let's get some background on the Cuban Revolution itself. In January 1959, a revolution led by Fidel Castro and Ernesto Che Guevara toppled a pro-American government of Cuba. The USA had significant economic links with Cuba, including interests in the sugar and oil industries and a lot of American land ownership and investment, for example, in the rail system. Castro, as a Cuban nationalist, wanted Cuba's economy to be independent of the USA. He wasn't yet openly declaring himself a communist, but it was pretty clear that he had sympathies in that direction. The situation was made even more tense because of Cuba's close proximity to the United States, less than 100 miles off the coast of Florida. Eisenhower, who was president in 1959, had to tread very carefully. There were several outcomes for international relations from the Cuban Revolution. The USA recognised the new government but refused economic aid unless Cuba agreed to IMF or International Monetary Fund rules. In May 1959, Castro seized land owned by non-Cubans, which basically meant Americans. He offered compensation, but this was not recognised by the USA. The land was seized anyway. In February 1960, though, Khrushchev agreed to buy Cuban sugar and tobacco, which was a significant economic boost for the new government. There was also a secret agreement from the USSR to provide weapons to Castro's government, something that they desperately needed. The USA first reduced its trade with Cuba from July 1960, and then it ended trade links altogether in October of that year. Concern over Cuba's Soviet links led the USA to end diplomatic relations with Cuba in January 1961. Short of going to war, that's about as frosty as relations can get. The USA hatched a plan to try and undo the Cuban Revolution. President Kennedy assumed office in 1961. He immediately threw his support behind a plan which the CIA and Eisenhower had originally come up with. The USA would support a group of around 1,400 Cuban exiles with weapons and training. These men would then attack Cuba and attempt to overthrow Castro's government in a coup. The USA hoped that by using Cuban exiles, they could deny direct involvement and instead claim that it was a form of counter-revolution. On the 17th of April 1961, this invasion force landed at the Bay of Pigs in Cuba. But it was an utter fiasco. So what went wrong? On the map we can see the rough location of the Bay of Pigs here. This is where the invading force arrived. The Cuban Revolutionary Army was motivated and battle-hardened by their fight to win the revolution in 1959. However, the CIA-trained exiles were neither of these things, and no match for them. When things began to go wrong, therefore, the USA could not send air support or troops, as they wanted to deny all involvement. The outclassed invaders, who were also outnumbered more than 10 to 1, were on their own. And let's not forget, there were only about 1,400 invaders facing up against 20,000 men in the Revolutionary Army. The CIA plan partly relied on an assumption that the Cuban people would support the invasion. Instead, most Cubans supported Castro. Castro paraded wrecked and captured equipment. It was obviously American supplied, like this A-26 Invader bomber here. Kennedy and the USA were humiliated. The Soviet Union was delighted. What were the outcomes of the Bay of Pigs invasion? The USA had long accused the USSR of empire building in Europe with its satellite states, but after the 1961 attempted coup in Cuba, the same accusation was levelled at the USA on their own doorstep. The Cuban people's obvious support of Castro was used by Khrushchev to argue that this meant people were happy under communism, a significant propaganda win. After the invasion, Castro declared himself to be a communist publicly, and USSR-Cuban relations became much stronger. Consequently, Khrushchev publicly announced that the USSR would supply Cuba with weapons to resist any future US invasion, including some of their most modern designs like this MiG-21. Kennedy reacted with concern. Cuba would get up-to-date weapons and training from the USSR. However, the big fear was that the USSR would supply Cuba with nuclear weapons. The following year, this issue would plunge the world into a terrifying crisis, the Cuban Missile Crisis, which I'll cover in the next video. Let's sum everything up. In January 1959, Fidel Castro overthrew the pro-USA government of Cuba in a revolution. The USA initially accepted this, albeit reluctantly, but by 1961 had severed economic and diplomatic ties to Cuba. The USSR strengthened its relations with Cuba's government, providing both weapons and economic support. The CIA planned an invasion using American-trained and supplied exiles, but the Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961 was a humiliating failure for the USA. As a result, Castro declared himself a communist. Khrushchev increased economic and military support for Cuba. Kennedy looked weak and feared that Soviet nuclear weapons in Cuba would follow this situation, something that did come true and we'll cover in the next video on the Cuban Missile Crisis. But that's it for now. Thanks very much for watching, and if this video has been useful to you, please do like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps. But for now, thanks and goodbye.